Hi everyone, welcome to another lesser known history, homeschool history lesson, where every month we take a look at an event or a person in history that is important but that you may not have heard about. So welcome. So in this homeschool history lesson, we're going to be talking about the year without a summer. So when was the year without a summer? Well, the year was 1816, and 1816 was unusually cold. The summer of 1816 was unlike any summer people could remember. Snow fell in New England, gloomy cloud rains fell throughout Europe. It was cold, stormy, and dark, nothing like a typical summer weather. This year is also known as 1800 and froze to death and the poverty year. So here are some quotes from people during 1816. Here's one quote. The fields are as bare of herbage as usually in the month of November, and the verdure of the forest has the appearance of fall. What is to become of this country, it is impossible to divine, wrote one Boston reporter. And then, another quote, we have had the most extraordinary year of drought and cold ever known in the history of America, which Thomas Jefferson wrote in a letter to Albert Gattolin on September 8, 1816. So 1816 was very cold and the weather was very odd. Snow fell in several countries in Europe in June, and there was a snowfall in London on August 30th that year. And a correspondent in Paris wrote to a friend in America on August 25th, 1816, and they said, quote, all accounts agree that in the memory of no man living has been a season so cold. They observe there has been no summer. Such, however, is the fertility of our soil. The crops will be tolerably good. Rice, etc., are not recommended to be sent. None of the bankruptcies which have taken place in England and America have reached here. And here is actually a picture of the correspondence I just read from the correspondent in Paris to their friend in America on August 25th, 1816, and this was printed in the Maryland Gazette on October 17th, 1816, and it was citing a letter from the Boston Daily Advertiser that was published in October 9th, 1816. So what caused this? Well, it all started with a volcano called Mount Tambora. This volcano erupted in 1815. This eruption released vast amounts of ash, rock, and sulfuric dust into the air, which dramatically lowered temperatures across many areas of the world the following year. Reports of odd weather came in from all over the world in 1816, summer frost in North America, red snow in Italy, and 8 weeks of nonstop rain in Ireland. This volcanic eruption changed the world. So here are a couple photos of volcanic eruptions. These aren't the photos of the Mount Tambora eruption, but these are two other volcanic eruptions, and you can see the amount of ash and debris that's being spread into the air. So you can just imagine that Mount Tambora was even bigger than this. So here is a brief timeline of the eruption of Mount Tambora. In 1812, Mount Tambora starts rumbling and emits a dark cloud. April 5th, 1815, Mount Tambora erupts, sending up plumes of fire and ash. The sounds from this eruption can be heard as far as 870 miles away. On April 10th, 1815, Mount Tambora's eruptions intensifies, and the mountain becomes a flowing mass of liquid fire. This eruption can be heard 1,600 miles away. April 17th, 1815, Mount Tambora's eruptions finally come to an end. So let's discuss the eruption of Mount Tambora. Mount Tambora is located in Sumbawa, an island on the eastern edge of Indonesia. Mount Tambora erupted in April 1815. The ash cloud from this eruption would hover in the upper atmosphere for 3 years. The eruption laid waste to the global climate. This event caused a volcanic winter that put the world in a deep freeze. The average global temperature was lowered by about 1 degree. This led to snow in summer, droughts in winter, and many violent thunderstorms. So here is a picture of a map, and you can see Mount Tambora is the little pin right in the center, right under Indonesia. It is near Australia, and you can see about how far it is away from India. So you can judge by this map that the fact that the effects were felt all the way in Europe meant that this was a very big eruption. Nobody had reason to believe this volcano would erupt. Mount Tambora, like many volcanoes, looked like an ordinary mountain, and it had been dormant for centuries. Its peak was over 14,000 feet high, and the top of its peak was almost always snow-covered. But in April 1815, it erupted in glorious fashion. After it erupted, Mount Tambora's peak was now only about 9,800 feet high. The eruption of Mount Tambora killed approximately 90,000 people throughout the Indonesian islands, and by the time the climate returned to normal, as many as 30 million people had died from Tambora's effects. And here is another map of Tambora. It is the pin you can see, and it's a little closer up. You can see more of the islands around Indonesia, and you can in the corner see Malaysia. So let's talk about the eruption strength of Mount Tambora. When Tambora erupted, it spewed millions of tons of volcanic debris into the air. This discharge included 55 million tons of sulfur dioxide gas, which was hurled 20 miles into the stratosphere. 10 billion tons of rock was ejected in the eruption. The eruption column stretched 141,000 feet in the air. The eruption of Mount Tambora is the largest recorded volcanic eruption in history. And here is a picture of the Mount Tambora eruption. The red areas are maps of the thickness of the volcanic ash fall, so you can see how far the ash spread around the Indonesian islands. And the ash spread considerably far. So now let's discuss some of the effects of the eruption of Mount Tambora. The eruption of Mount Tambora had many effects on crops and did eventually lead to a lot of famine. 1816 is known as the year without a summer, and no summer meant no food. In England, sleet, rain, and snow during April kept farmers from their spring planting. When farmers could finally plant, the chilly weather stunted their crops. That fall, grain harvests were 75% lower than usual. In Italy, it snowed so much that no wheat was planted at all. Potatoes rotted in the cold weather, and the price of bread skyrocketed. This is why 1816 is also known as the Year of the Baker. Snowstorms and floods struck France, England, Ireland, and Switzerland. There were droughts and floods in India and killing frosts across northern China. Poor people often starved, and people with money often chose to migrate. The number of Europeans who immigrated to the United States in 1817 was twice that of the previous year. But America was also greatly affected by Mount Tambora's eruption. In June 1816, wild winter snowstorms raged in Vermont. In July 1816, a killing frost struck the East Coast. Snow destroyed thousands of East Coast farms, from Virginia up to Maine. The growing season in New England was shorter than average by 55 days. Things were so bad in New England that many people moved westward. In 1816, 42,000 people migrated from New England to Indiana. So here are some first-hand accounts from people discussing the weather and its effects on crops in 1816. In Bridgeport, Connecticut in June 1816, the remarkable change of weather from extreme heat to cold was as great here as the following paragraphs describe it to have been at the eastward. All kinds of vegetation has suffered, and some plants have been entirely destroyed by the cold and frost. And here is a photo of the clipping that I just read aloud that was published in the Republican Farmer on June 12, 1816, that discusses the remarkable changes to the weather. So now let's discuss Mount Tambora's eruption's influence on the arts. The eruption of Mount Tambora impacted life all over the globe, but the bizarre weather in 1816 also had a great impact on culture and literature. It influenced everything from literary works to paintings. One of the most famous pieces of literature that was influenced by the eruption of Mount Tambora was written by a teenage girl named Mary Shelley in 1816. In 1816, Mary Shelley and her husband, the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, decided to take a holiday in Switzerland. This turned out to be a very important trip for Mary Shelley. Mary and her companions were looking forward to spending the summer months together in a large house near Lake Geneva. This group included the poet Lord Byron, his personal physician, and Mary's stepsister. The outdoor activities that the group had been eagerly anticipating were washed out by the constant torrential cloudbursts in Switzerland that year. The weather was constantly too cold and dreary that summer to enjoy the outdoor holiday activities they had planned. so the group often spent their time indoors. And here are some accounts from Mary Shelley about the weather during that summer. The spring, as the inhabitants informed us, was unusually late, and indeed the cold was excessive. As we ascended the mountains, the same clouds which rained on us in the valleys poured forth large flakes of snow thick and fast. The sun occasionally shone through these showers. That's a letter from Mary Shelley discussing their arrival in Geneva in May 1816. And then Mary Shelley also goes on to say, but it proved a wet, ungenial summer, and incessant rain often confined us for days to the house. And here's another account from Mary Shelley. It began to rain almost as soon as we left our inn. When we had mounted considerably, we turned to look on the scene. A dense white mist covered the vale, and tops of scattered pines peeping above were the only objects that presented themselves. The rain continued in torrents. We were wetted to the skin. And this was in a letter from Mary Shelley in July 1816. So, because of the unusual weather, the group had to find ways to amuse themselves without leaving the house. Sound familiar? They amused themselves by reading ghost stories. Then Lord Byron proposed that they each write a ghost story. Everyone eagerly began writing their stories. But Mary couldn't seem to think of a story, and she became anxious about this since her companions kept asking her every day, "Have you thought of a story?" Then, one dark and stormy night, Mary had a nightmarish vision with a vividness far beyond the usual bounds of reverie. Mary would later recall, "I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion." Mary turned her nightmare into a story about a scientist, Victor Frankenstein, who creates a monstrous creature in an unorthodox scientific experiment. Later, back in England, she expanded this short story into a novel. Published anonymously at first in 1818, she titled the work Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus. Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus, is often regarded as the first science fiction novel. Since its first publication, the book has never been out of print. So, let's talk about Frankenstein. Frankenstein has inspired numerous plays, movies, TV shows, books, and more. The character of Frankenstein's monster remains one of the most recognized icons in fiction. Frankenstein is often listed as one of the most influential novels of all time. So here you'll see a drawing of the Castle Frankenstein, which Mary Shelley passed by on one of her trips. And it was where she got the name for her scientist and her book. And you'll also see an image of Boris Karloff as the Frankenstein's monster in one of the most famous adaptations of Frankenstein in film. So let's discuss the author of Frankenstein, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. She was born August 30th, 1797, and she died February 1st, 1851. And here's a great quote from her. "I think that I can maintain myself, and there is something inspiriting in the idea." Mary Shelley was born Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin in London in 1797. She was the second child of the feminist, philosopher, and writer Mary Wollstonecraft. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, died less than a month after giving birth. In 1814, when she was 16, Mary eloped to Italy with the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. In 1816, Mary, Percy, and several others went on vacation in Switzerland. Mary began writing Frankenstein during this trip. She published Frankenstein in 1818, and Mary Shelley is widely regarded as the mother of science fiction. So here are some books and articles that I recommend if you want to learn more about The Year Without a Summer and Mary Shelley. The first book is Eruptions and Explosions, Real Tales of Violent Outbursts by Judy Dodge Cummings. This is a great juvenile nonfiction book. It had a ton of amazing information in there, so I really recommend that one. The second book is I Survived True Stories, Nature Attacks, 4 Terrifying Tales of Disaster and Survival by Lauren Tarshis. This is in the I Survived series. This has a whole chapter on Tambora, and it gives some really great first-hand accounts, so I really recommend that one. The third book is called Tambora, The Eruption That Changed the World by Gillian Darcy Wood. And this is an adult nonfiction book, and it is a kind of dense read, but there's a lot of really great information in there. So the next book that I'd recommend is called When Humans Nearly Vanished, The Catastrophic Explosion of the Toba Volcano by Donald R. Prothero. And this has a whole little section on The Year Without a Summer. It's an adult nonfiction book, but it's got some really good information in there. And then the other book that I really recommend about The Year Without a Summer is called The Year Without a Summer, 1816 and the Volcano That Darkened the World and Changed History by William K. Klingemann. And this one is an entire book about it. It divides it into some really great sections. It's an adult nonfiction book. It is a bit thick, but there's a lot of fantastic information in there, so I really recommend that book. So here are some books if you want to read more about Mary Shelley and Frankenstein. And the first one is Frankenstein, How a Monster Became an Icon, The Science and Enduring Allure of Mary Shelley's Creation by Sidney Perkowitz. It's a really great adult nonfiction book that talks all about the different influences of Mary Shelley. The second book is called Mary, Who Wrote Frankenstein by Linda Bailey. This is a great juvenile nonfiction book. It has some amazing illustrations, and it's really just a very simplistic story of how Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. And then the third book is called She Made a Monster, How Mary Shelley Created Frankenstein. It's another juvenile nonfiction book, but it's more like a picture book. It only has a few words on each page, but it's really fantastic. The illustrations are amazing, and if you only read one book about Mary Shelley, I highly recommend She Made a Monster. And here are two really fantastic articles that I recommend if you want to read more about Mary Shelley and Frankenstein. The first is The Strange and Twisted Life of Frankenstein. After 200 Years, Are We Ready for the Truth About Mary Shelley's Novel by Jill Lepore. And that was published in February 5th, 2018 in the New Yorker magazine. I put the link below, but you can just search The Strange and Twisted Life of Frankenstein and it'll come up in Google. And the second article is How a Teenage Girl Became the Mother of Horror. Mary Shelley combined science and supernatural to write Frankenstein, the world's first science fiction novel. That was in the National Geographic History magazine, and I put the link below, but if you Google How a Teenage Girl Became the Mother of Horror, you'll be able to find it. And those are two really fantastic articles about Mary Shelley and her life and everything that led up to her the creation of Frankenstein. So looking ahead, 2020 has been a difficult year to say the least. And as 2020 draws to a close, it's important to remember that humanity has had other truly difficult years. Years like 1816. But even though the year 1816 was truly horrible, people found the strength to keep going. So here's to 2021, and may we all find the strength to keep going. Happy New Year, and I'll see you next month and next year for another lesser-known history, Homeschool History Lessons. Bye.